Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think my video has decided to conquer it. So we might just see how I can go. But while I'm, oh no, there it's back. No, it's frozen again. Anyway, that's going to play up during the night. I hope it's not too distracting. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honour. Well, firstly, can I thank you all for joining us for a Pitt lecture, Pitt Dialogue lecture. As you know, the Pitt Dialogue was named after Sir William Pitt the Younger, the longest serving Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And the reason he is important to the seat or to the Northern Beaches is so many of our well-known geographic locations are named after Pitt. So we have Pittwater Road, we have Pittwater itself, and there are lots of other places named after William Pitt. And we also thought that William Pitt is a political leader worth actually following. He was someone who took care of the finances of the United Kingdom. He saw the United Kingdom through the Napoleonic Wars, helping the British Navy win at Trafalgar. He also was instrumental in ending the slave trade, although that happened after his death. So he was an important and critical reformer at an important and critical time in the United Kingdom. So it seems entirely appropriate that we would ask Professor Paul Hunter, who is a professor in medicine at the University of East Anglia, to join us today to talk about living with COVID. Professor Hunter was the first professor of health protection in the United Kingdom when he was appointed to the Norwich Medical School in 2001. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, the Royal Society of Biology, and the Faculty of Public Health. He holds an MB-CHB and an MD from the University of Manchester and an MBA from the Open University. He has an H-index of 77 according to Google Scholar. And before he begins, I'm going to ask him what an H-index is, but it sounds very impressive. But ladies and gentlemen, can I please welcome Professor Paul Hunter. Professor Hunter, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm very honoured to be asked to talk to you today. I've got a few slides, but then as I understand it, it's going to be more of a discourse and an answer and question session, so that would be good. An H-index, by the way, is basically just a measure of how widely your work has been used by other scientists, and an H-index of 60 means that 60 of your papers have been cited more than 60 times, so that's where that comes. And actually, your high H score is as much to do with how old you are as how effective you are, because the more you're working, the more papers you publish, so your H score goes up, and the more times people have had to sign them. Anyway, if that's okay, shall I press on?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, when we have a new problem like COVID, people have a range of strategies that they employ to try and help them understand what's going on and what is likely to work and what isn't. And my strategy generally is to look at what we know about very similar organisms. Now, a lot of people have looked at influenza, but to me, coronaviruses are really nothing much like influenza. And so what I did initially at the start of the outbreak, look at some of the other coronaviruses. The most recent one of relevance was SARS back in about 2003. And so come in January of last year, February of last year, I was confidently predicting by the summer it would have disappeared, as SARS did in 15 years ago. But it didn't, and so what I then realised is that there was probably other better coronaviruses around, and so a lot of what has been influencing my work has been what I've learned about these other coronaviruses. And actually, this isn't the first pandemic that we've had from a coronavirus like this. The last one was the Russian flu. It started in about 1989, but really only hit in the UK in about 1990. For years, it was thought to be an influenza, but genetic analysis suggested that probably it was this other coronavirus, a beta coronavirus, just like the COVID virus, with the really catchy title of OC43. And the genetic analysis has really shown that that virus appeared in human society very close to 1990. So that's partly why we think it was a coronavirus, not a flu. The other interesting thing is that the disease is much more similar from the descriptions of disease from the Russian flu to what we're seeing with COVID than ever it was to the other influenza epidemics, such as the 1919 Spanish flu, and including its more tendency to cause more longer-term post-acute symptoms. And finally, as well, the epidemiology of it, how it spread within British society all those years ago, is very similar to what we've seen in COVID, including its attack on particular age groups. Now, the big thing about the Russian flu was it caused a huge amount of deaths for ultimately over 4 years, but the vast majority of those deaths were in 1889, 1890. That's 130 years ago. That's a mistake in the graph. So 130 years ago, it caused a large number of deaths, particularly in 1890 and 1891, but also probably as well for the next 2 years. And then it disappeared. Nobody then after that really commented on the Russian flu. And the next big thing, of course, was at the end of the First World War. That was the Spanish flu. But OC43, that very same virus, is still with us. It's actually very common. Most children, the large majority of children, will have had at least one infection by the time they're 3.5 years old. And after that, typically we think that this virus infects us about every 3 to 6 years throughout life. Sometimes much shorter gap between the viruses, sometimes a bit longer. But Russian flu isn't around still. And virtually all of those infections are either asymptomatic or at worst a mild cold. But you still occasionally see severe disease in our most vulnerable and are immune suppressed. But apart from that, it's very rare to see any severe disease. In fact, it's so rare that when people see cases, they often write it up in the science journals. So what happened? I mean, it's still essentially the same virus that killed millions, probably more 130 years ago than so far COVID has killed, at a time when the world population was a lot smaller. Now, the big thing about that, the big lesson from the Russian flu is coronavirus is here to stay. And the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, is here to stay. And this isn't actually that surprising and that new. I think the first time that I said this was, I think, last August, September, I think, was the first time it was recorded that I can find a paper with me saying this, that our grandchildren's grandchildren will be catching this virus. And a lot of people have said to me since then that have cast doubt on me saying that. But very few of them are actually people who've worked in infectious disease. In January, Nature magazine, probably the most high-profile journal in medicine and sciences, asked more than 100 of the world's top immunologists, infectious disease researchers, and virologists, all of whom have had considerable experience of working on coronaviruses, and they asked whether it could be eradicated. And 90% of people said that they were sure or pretty sure that the coronavirus would become endemic. And what endemic means is that the virus is there all the time. And when you have a virus that is endemic, one of the key things about that is herd immunity won't happen. Now, so many people, very few of them actually experts in infectious disease dynamics, have been pushing the idea that herd immunity is achievable with COVID. It was never going to be achievable, and the reason for that, and sometimes that's because people don't know what herd immunity actually is. Herd immunity is the protection that you would have if you aren't immunized, because all the rest of your herd, your neighbors, are immunized. So with measles, if everybody else in your town is immunized against measles, then you won't catch measles. But that doesn't apply to COVID, so herd immunity is not achievable. Now, in that Nature paper, they produced, based on their discussions with scientists, they produced a flowchart, and each part of the flowchart had questions about whether this or that was likely to happen. And at the time in January, we didn't totally know what everything, what the answers were to everything, and some of them would debate, but we pretty much do know the answers to everything now. And these were some of the key nodes. And the output was on the right, but in the original figure, there were lots of different outputs depending on your answers to these questions. So, does immunity from vaccine wane? Yes, that is unequivocal now. We know that it does. Particularly immunity to infection wanes often quite quickly, both after vaccination and after natural infection. Primarily immunity to infection rather than severe disease. Protection against severe disease is longer lasting. Will the virus escape immunity, so-called escape mutations? And the answer to that is yes. And one of the questions is about that, and I'll come back to that later on. So, can vaccines block transmission? Well, no, they can't. They do reduce the risk of transmission, but they can't block it. And we're seeing with even double vaccinated people, maybe at best you can reduce the risk of transmission by about 50%, maybe a bit more, 60%, but there is still that risk there. And then the last two was, is herd immunity achievable? And I've already said it's not. And it's not achievable because vaccines and natural infection don't guarantee you won't get infected. although they do reduce the chance quite a sizable margin, but not enough to achieve herd immunity. And of course, that over a period of a few months, that protection against infection declines. Can vaccines prevent severe disease? And the answer to that is yes. They're very good at preventing severe disease, and even better at preventing severe disease than they are at preventing infection. And furthermore, that protection applies to the new variants. So even when you have a new variant, that protection against severe disease seems to be just as strong, just as good, or at least it is so far. And the outcome for that was roughly what I've got here. And so if in the original Nature article, and it was the virus will continue to circulate, but once people are protected from severe disease, either through vaccination or because they've already had one infection and recovered, it's likely to only cause mild and generally asymptomatic illness. In other words, it'll behave exactly like beta coronavirus OC43. And I think at that point, I will pause the slides and for the time being, and move on to the questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter. So given what you've just said, did you mean that the virus will evolve to get around the vaccines?
To a certain extent, yes. Yes, and we've seen this already happening. The South African variant, the beta variant, which came from South Africa, was somewhat better. The Delta variant is a little bit better at getting around the vaccines than the Alpha variant was, but none of those vaccines were totally escaped from vaccine control. They were gradual, and we see this with the other coronaviruses. The other viruses are continually throwing up escape mutations, which helps them get around previous immunity, but that is never total and never complete, at least in a single step. And typically it takes about 7 to 20 years for one of the other coronaviruses to evolve to become totally uncontrolled by previous immunity, because of course we don't have vaccines for these other coronaviruses.
Professor Hunter, have you turned on your video screen, the camera? Sorry.
Have I? Oh, sorry. Yeah. There we go.
And don't worry, mine's frozen, so no one's doing well at this point. Thank you. Look, I guess the other question I have is, so really, the question I suppose we should be asking is that over time, this gives us time to come up with better and more effective vaccines. Is that a fair way of looking at it, or not really?
Well, the big issue is whether actually we need more vaccines, because if this is a virus that is going to be circulating forever, and going to infect us regularly and provide that boost against severe disease, then ultimately, we don't need vaccines for the OC43 virus. Infections are pretty mild and asymptomatic in the vast majority of cases. So ultimately, we won't need, if we left it to its own devices, within a few years, the disease would become part of our history, even though the virus would circulate. The problem is that if you left it to your own devices too soon, you'd end up with huge numbers of deaths and long-term ill health from people whose lungs were damaged and all sorts of issues like that, which would have a huge economic burden on the health service as well. So the issue is, how do we get from where we were to the point where this is just a harmless virus that circulates in society forever?
So this is kind of like a bridge then to that point.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I
Exactly, good
suppose
metaphor, yeah.
so is the Spanish flu the last serious flu we dealt with? Coronavirus?
No, I mean, we've had a number of flu pandemics over the last 100 and something years, and the Spanish flu was by far the worst. It caused probably about 20 million deaths globally at a time when the world's population was a lot smaller than it is now. And you can imagine, and the Spanish flu was a dreadful way to die as well. It targeted young people. So you've been fighting in the trenches for 4 years in Europe, only to be able to go home to your loved ones, and then within months you're dead. And it targeted, the Spanish flu targeted younger people as well, rather than the older people. And there's a reason for that, is that younger people's immunity was better than the older people's immunity. And it wasn't the flu that killed you in the Spanish flu, it was your body's overreaction to fighting the virus off. Something called a cytokine cascade, and it was actually a very unpleasant way of dying as well. So that's that was probably the worst. But we've had pandemics of influenza on and off ever since then, and of course we've had a range of other global pandemics as well. HIV, particularly dreadful pandemic.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go to some pre-submitted questions, and I can already see there's some really good questions coming in the chat function. So Dr. Spencer asked, who's a medical doctor, what does living with COVID mean exactly? Will it mean no non-pharmacological inventions, i.e. that is lockdowns is your mind in your mind?
Yeah, ultimately that means that. Ultimately, and not that far away. You know, it took 4 years for the Russian flu, the last big, for it to become something in history. And they didn't have social distancing, they didn't have vaccines, they didn't have reasonably effective therapies. And ultimately, that's the way it's going to be here with this. You know, we won't. I can't see in 10 years' time. I can't see any of us paying any attention to this virus, to be honest, other than as a history lesson. It will go the same way, and how quickly we get to that point will depend in many ways on how well we've vaccinated populations, and also how badly those countries that have been hit with the virus till now. And I think one of the things in England, as I said, we opened up our society in the 19th of July. And despite many people's predictions that cases would rocket after that, they actually fell. Now they didn't, they didn't fall because we opened up. They fell because we got to the finals in the European Football Championships, and when the finals were on, that was a big driver for increases in the in transmission of COVID in England. It was in Scotland as well for the first part, but because the Scottish team never made it through into the knockout stage, they left and they found their cases tumbling somewhat earlier than our cases. And I was the only academic that predicted cases would fall on the BBC beforehand, and but that was largely because of what I was seeing happening in Scotland and looking at the way that would pan out in England as well. So ultimately, we'll get to that point. It won't but you know, we're not there yet, and I suspect the point that we get to that point will vary from one country to another depending on its history.
Okay. Have you started to see upward trend in cases in the UK?
Well, the schools went back, and again, a lot of people were very nervous about schools going back. Schools went back on the 3rd of September in England. In the week or two up to that, a number of pundits were expressing serious reservations about opening schools again. And actually what's happened is that now that schools are open, cases are falling. So, and I didn't expect cases to rise because schools were opening, in part because, but I certainly didn't expect them to fall as quickly as they seem to be doing. And hopefully this will continue to some point, but ultimately cases will get to some sort of equilibrium value that, because this isn't going to go away, and that equilibrium value will, in infectious disease epidemiology, it's called the endemic equilibrium. This is the point within when an endemic disease, that's sort of the average amount of infection that you get over a number of years. And I think we're fairly close to that in the UK, but we will continue to see cases. They won't disappear by a long way, I don't think.
Okay. All right. Kristen Bird asks, we live with the flu. Once vaccinated is living with COVID like living with the flu. I think your answer is yes, isn't it?
Well, no, I don't think it is, because
Okay.
I don't think.
I'm glad I answered that question for you.
Yeah, I don't think it. And as I've said, I think flu and COVID are actually very different things. And I think the big difference between influenza and COVID is that influenza evolves in two ways. It evolves through mutation, and it evolves through which is called genetic drift, and it evolves through what's called genetic shift, which is usually where different flu viruses, probably one animal virus, one human virus, mixed together and produce a progeny that is more virulent or more infectious or whatever. And you almost certainly don't get shift with the coronaviruses, but you do get drift. So we're not likely to see the huge pandemics that we will expect to see about influenza. We typically in the past have seen them about every 20, 30 years. And ultimately, COVID will probably, for most of us, become a totally symptomatic disease. People often have said, what do we have to do to learn how to live with COVID? And we don't have to do anything. This will happen, whether we try and learn stuff or not. And so the other thing about influenza is, because you're getting rapid changing of different influenza viruses, you've always got to keep topping up the vaccine and changing the vaccine. And most winters influenza vaccines in England, we sort of look at the WHO look towards what's happening in your part of the world to plan our winter's vaccines, and then tend to look at our part of the world to plan your next season's vaccines. So, but I can't see that happening with COVID at all. I think it'll just, because of this protection against severe disease being quite robust, I think we will ultimately see it just fizzling out and disappearing from our consciousness, really. But the virus will still be around.
Well, that's the next big question, which is can we behave differently during summer months as compared to winter? If so, can we be freer to have more limited restrictions during the summer months like Europe? Why do death rates still keep going, even though more percentage of people who are vaccinated with both jabs increase?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that we behave differently in winter and summer anyway, and a lot of the things that we tend to do in summer that we don't tend to do in winter, at least in parts of the world that you have cold, wet winters, will mean that in summer the virus spreads less readily. And there was a Japanese paper several months ago now, and what they found is that the risk of other things being equal, you know, how long you were with somebody, a case, how close you were to them, and all that sort of thing, but other things being equal, if you were indoors, you were about 18 or 19 times more likely to spread the infection from one person to another than if you were outdoors. So clearly, when you're outdoors, you know, having your barbecue in the garden, the risk of transmission is actually very low. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why, although a number of European countries wanted you to wear face coverings out of doors, we've never wanted that or required it in the UK. And I think that is absolutely the right decision when you're outdoors, unless you're in a really crowded environment, like, I don't know, like a demonstration or whatever, but where there's lots of people around in a tight space, or that the risk of transmission outdoors is substantially lower. And that's why, in part, it's more difficult to control in winter when people are indoors than it is in summer.
Okay, well, Mark asks, it is likely the countries with low vaccination and high infection rates will continue to give rise to new variants. And I did actually want to ask you that question. Are they the two sort of preconditions to variants? As Australia opens its international borders, how can we best protect our population from such new COVID variants like C12, first detected in South Africa in April?
Yeah, well, I've got a couple of more slides on new variants that okay. One of the things, there's been a lot of confused talking about new variants. There are essentially two issues about new variants. The first, what we've already touched on, is the issue around what's called escape variants. Variants that other things are equal, but they're a bit more resistant to vaccine or immunity from prior infection. And then there are the variants that increase the host fitness, the virus fitness, so that makes the virus more infectious, more virulent. And we know that we already have a fairly good idea about the evolution of viruses once they jump hosts. And this is a quote from this paper in Nature Reviews, Microbiology Reviews. Viruses that jump hosts undergo strong and stringent adaptive selection as they maximize their new niche, maximize their fit to the new niche. So the way I describe it is a lock and a key. We're the lock and the virus is the key. And you've got this key that doesn't fit very well. So it's not that infectious, it's not that virulent necessarily. But over time, the key gets a better and better fit and it becomes fitter and more infectious. And ultimately, we've had 3 of those lineages, mutations since the start of this epidemic. And the other thing about this is that once there is a best fit, once you've got the key is the best fit for the lock, any further change will make it worse again. So there is a maximum fit. And the issue is whether we have achieved that, because if we've achieved it, then we're not going to get any new variants that are going to cause a big problem. And, you know, up until now, the variants have caused a very big problem. This is one of my favorite graphs that I've made. And what this is all the lineages that have been described since in the UK, been identified in the UK, and it's the top most common 50 lineages. And you can see that from when we, and of course the black is the remaining 800 or so lineages that I just, Excel would have fallen over in horror if I tried to include different colours for them. But you can see that early on there was this mutation G614G, which increased the infectiousness and the fitness. Then there's huge numbers of these other variants, and then alpha comes along and virtually, but doesn't totally wipe the floor with them. It didn't compete well against the beta variant in South Africa. They coexisted, and then Delta came along, and Delta really has wiped the floor with every other variant. So there is no country that Delta has turned up in that actually any of the other variants have managed to hold out for very long. And you can see in the UK, the Delta variant is now responsible for over 99.9% of all our infections. So I think that is probably the best fit. I'm not certain, but the interesting thing is that the Delta variant appeared first about last October, November time, and there's been nothing since then that looks as though it's going to come close to it. So my guess, but I'm not absolutely certain, is that we're not going to see another wave because of another big variant that is a much better fit for the lock that we represent. But I've already mentioned the fact that beta coronaviruses undergo genetic drift, and they do indeed do that. And you can see here that in the top table 2, and this is from UK Vaccine Surveillance Report, that the vaccines aren't as good at preventing infection, again, due to the Delta variant as they were due to the Alpha variant. But they're still, and you can see in table 3, really good at preventing severe disease and preventing hospitalization. And even after a single dose of vaccine, you reduce the risk of hospitalization by 80%, even of the Delta variant. So ultimately, yes, we are going to see new variants, but I doubt whether they will be the same impact that we've seen with the Alpha and then the Delta variants in terms of generating a further surge. I can't be absolutely sure, but I think the balance of probabilities is looking like that's not going to happen. And this genetic drift that we see happening with the other coronaviruses and that we're already seeing with COVID will contribute to the virus continuing to circulate, and make some years a little bit worse than others, but ultimately won't substantially increase the risk of severe disease.
All right, thank you. They're actually really interesting. Is that AZ vaccine?
It's both, yes.
Right. Okay, so
it's a mixture. In terms of the difference between AZ and Pfizer, AZ isn't as good as Pfizer at preventing infection after the second dose. They're about the same for the first dose, but both Pfizer and AZ are equally effective, or very closely equally effective, at preventing hospitalization. So and so they are But as I think I've already said, vaccine alone isn't going to stop this virus spreading. It'll just stop us getting as sick as we would have done, and ultimately stop us getting sick at all once in coming years, I suspect.
So just to be clear, so AZ is better. Sorry, AZ is not as good at stopping the symptoms. But
no, it's not as good at stopping infection. Whether
oh,
that is
okay, right.
And
you
after you get infection, you may or may not get symptoms. And
but infection doesn't matter, does it? It's whether you get the symptoms.
Well, I would argue that it doesn't, unless you're going to then spread that infection to somebody else who's vulnerable and who would get severe disease. But you know, for you, if you get infection and are not symptomatic, that for you, yeah, so what? You know, it's not going to be a big deal if you don't get ill.
Yes, yeah. Okay, given the risk, so Rosalind Barnes asks, given the risk to health of both COVID and the vaccine and the apparent waning of the benefits of vaccine, Israel now required booster doses. Sorry, what is the way forward for both vaccinated and unvaccinated people, and how can we avoid an apartheid-like two-tiered system with the loss of human rights?
Right, well, I mean, the first thing to say is people who haven't been vaccinated at some point are going to get infected. Okay. That is pretty much guaranteed. And when you get infected, you will have the same risk of severe disease and death as anybody who, depending on your age and your previous medical history, as anybody at any time during the pandemic, and probably actually even more so, because in the unvaccinated, Delta is probably about twice as harmful as previous variants, give or take. So unvaccinated people will continue to suffer severe disease and death, depending, you know, clearly, you know, younger people won't suffer anywhere near that, but older people will, until they've survived their first infection, if they survive it. And so the issue for society is, if you've not got high vaccination coverage, and ultimately, you know, and you're still seeing big pressures on your health service, then how do you manage that? And that's a political decision more than a public health decision, I think, because how you balance the life and well-being of people who are not immunized and who won't have vaccine against the needs and wishes of people who have the rest of society, and that's a ethical and political decision, not a public health decision, not mine, certainly.
Okay. And then he asks, how do you suggest the immunocompromised and people who can't be vaccinated for health reasons live with COVID? What precautions should they take, and what can the rest of us do to protect them other than being vaccinated?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really difficult question, and I think this is the most difficult question to answer of all the ones that you circulated to me before the interview. There's actually ultimately not a lot you can do to guarantee these people will ultimately be safe if they are going to continue to circulate in society. And wearing face coverings provides some protection, and but face coverings, you know, they have value, but they're not a guarantee. The best guess estimate is that face coverings can reduce the risk of spreading the infection or being infected by between 10 and 20%. So, you know, it can't guarantee protection. And I think some of these, I think people are looking at treatments for early treatment that might be appropriate in these people if they start showing signs of developing. One of the things that I used to do when I still worked in clinical practice was, one of my jobs was to decide where people who were particularly vulnerable had been in contact with an infectious case, where it was you know, they'd been possibly exposed to rabies, or they were pregnant and they'd been in contact with somebody with chickenpox. And we would often give people what's called post-exposure prophylaxis, where, you know, you're pregnant, you've not had chickenpox in the past, you've gone to your toddler has got chickenpox, and after doing a number of tests, I would give you a lot of immunoglobulin, and that would be injected, and hopefully that would reduce the risk of you catching chickenpox and suffering severe disease, which some pregnant women do. How you would do that with COVID, when already a lot of infections are asymptomatic anyway, so you wouldn't necessarily know once, you know, that you've been in contact with somebody. In the UK, we have probably one of the most intense testing systems in the world, and we don't even pick up half the cases that we know are out there. So you can't rely on that. So ultimately, I think the way forward will be looking at, and you can't give these things continuously. That would bankrupt most health services. The cost of these sorts of immune globulins that you might wish to give would run into millions per person over a period of time. You know, it's but I suspect the way forward is further development and proof that certain treatments, if given early enough after the appearance of COVID, would then mitigate the more severe outcomes. And I suspect that is for people who can't be vaccinated and are still vulnerable. I suspect that is going to be the way forward. It's giving people, ensuring that people, when they develop symptoms, have access to rapid tests that then, if they're positive, you can start treating them. But I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in knowing how best to treat them in an effective way. But treatment is not something I've been following that carefully with COVID. There's just too much else to monitor.
Fair enough. Ben Moorcroft asks, as a parent of a 5 and 2-year-old, how is society expected to live with COVID when our children remain completely vulnerable and will be for the foreseeable future? With each passing variant, the younger generations appear to be more and more affected. Are we in a race to find a suitable vaccine for our young ones? And when do you believe a vaccine will become available in Australia? Finally, do you believe the mental impacts will surpass the physical impacts of COVID on toddlers and young children?
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that I think the evidence is that toddlers will suffer very little ill health from COVID. The severity of COVID in people who are otherwise well, that don't have serious underlying conditions, is inversely related to your age. So that, you know, if you're over 60 like me, then you're more at risk. If you're over 80, you're very at risk. If you're a teenager, there's a small risk. Lower grade school age, even lower risk. Toddlers, even lower risk of severe disease. So ultimately, I don't think we will be offering vaccine to children under 12, and certainly not preschoolers, I doubt very much. So, but that when they do, as they undoubtedly will, and as they are in the UK, catching COVID, they're unlikely, unless they've got other, extremely unlikely to suffer severe harm as a result of that infection, which is, and the problem is, we're seeing the side effects from vaccines are fairly low, such as myocarditis in young men and teenage boys. The side effects from vaccines are very low in older people and get increasingly more common as you get younger. So I think it would be, that's why I think we won't be going much younger than what we've got at the moment in terms of vaccine. And so ultimately, all toddlers alive in Australia will catch COVID, but most of the time you won't be able to tell it from a bad cold. And then they'll have the protection against future disease as they grow up.
Have the new variants though impacted younger people differently to the original variants?
Yeah, it's really difficult to answer that one, because how do you distinguish between differences in symptoms as a result of the new variants from differences in symptoms as a result of the fact that there's a lot more of the people who are getting this have already got some degree of immunity. And there was a series of comments and papers back a few months ago about the fact that Delta variant seems to be causing a very different clinical syndrome to Alpha variant, historically Alpha variant, and that it seemed to be causing a more common cold-like symptoms like sore throat and sneezing, which were not a feature of Alpha. But actually, I think now most people accept that that's nothing to do with the Delta variant, but just that we've got immunity, and that the prior immunity that we've got is changing the nature of that illness. But quite, and as why, and the other thing about why younger people are getting the Delta variant is interesting again, and in part that's because a lot of older people have had the vaccine and therefore are not as likely to get infected. But also as well, I think younger people, certainly in the UK, are moving around in society more. They're more likely to be in public-facing jobs. They're less likely to be able to work from home, and all these other things. And ultimately, you know, when they socialise, they're less likely to follow the rules that society has set up, and therefore that is a good enough reason why the Delta seems to be predominantly going for younger people. But you know, it's a very complex issue, and I don't think any of us totally understand all of well, certainly I don't understand all the things that are driving that.
Fair enough. Yeah, it will be interesting to see how this all plays out, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask me in 3 years' time and I'll know all of the answers.
That's right. The Prime Minister over here calls, like, you know, it's been amazing. There have been all these television epidemiologists over here who like have shown no humility whatsoever and get on. I don't even think they're epidemiologists. They assert that they're experts, and they get on and they say, you know, 6 months ago, oh, Australia doesn't need to get Pfizer. 6 months later, they're saying, oh, you really, the government really stuffed that up by not getting more Pfizer. They picked the wrong vaccine. And the Prime Minister calls them hindsight heroes. And I really do actually think that aptly describes them. In any case, Rosalind Gooding asks, how long do you think COVID will be around globally? And do you think babies to 12 years old will be vaccinated in future?
Right. Well, I think I've already answered that. I don't think babies will need to be vaccinated. And I think COVID is here for the long term. Our grandchildren's grandchildren will be catching this infection, but because the illness typically with the other coronaviruses, every child pretty much on the planet is infected with their first coronavirus at least once by the time they're 3.5. And I suspect that will be the case with COVID, and then they will go on and live the rest of their lives getting repeat infections, but not really knowing about it.
Okay, I think we're into the quick money round. So a question that occurred to me. Look, lab leak, bat bit a person or pangolin soup.
Yep.
Where do you sit on this? Is there much evidence of genetic engineering?
Right, I'm not a geneticist, and so I couldn't follow all of the arguments about the genetics. I think the thing to say is that I don't think we'll ever know. I mean, it's often hard, and I've spent most of my career investigating outbreaks of infectious disease and managing outbreaks and epidemics, and quite often, even for simple stuff, you never find out why it happened in the first place. And looking back 2 years later, it's almost certain that we won't be able to ever prove it one way or the other, even if we had access to all of the data that we would like from the Chinese.
Professor Hunter, I'm probably going to stop you there and just say, for what it's worth, I think when a country tries so hard to make it so difficult for people to track down what happened, those actions in and of themselves speak to a certain mindset.
Yeah, I mean, you may be right, but I mean, on the other hand, we do know that this is a virus that spreads within animals and has spread through the wildlife trade into China, or a similar virus, SARS, spread that route as well. So I sort of lean towards it's probably more likely to be the animal route, because that's what's happened before, and that animal trade still goes on, or still went on. But neither of us is going to be able to prove it one way or the other, are we?
No, true enough. So Anton asks, what's the current opinion on boosters and mixing the different vaccines? For example, if you've been double vaccinated with AZ, would it be okay to follow that with a Pfizer booster or a Moderna booster?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that mixing and matching vaccines has a long history before COVID came along, and actually the balance of evidence is that generally it's a good thing. It increases the immune response. I think there's sufficient evidence that if you've had and from European studies, that if you started off with AstraZeneca and then were boosted with Pfizer, that gave you better response than if you were boosted with AstraZeneca. I think if you are going to have a third dose, a booster at 6 months, then certainly mix and match is probably the way to go forward on that. Whether we need a third booster or not is still pretty much debated. WHO, the World Health Organization, is sort of arguing against it at the moment, primarily because it feels, quite rightly, that the benefits to the world as a whole would be for sharing those vaccines with countries that haven't been able to roll out their own program yet. And I think they're right on that. I think when you look at who we're vaccinating, I think not everybody will have responded well to the first 2 doses anyway. People who are immune suppressed, people on steroids. And in the UK, we'd already started boosting those people. people who are really immune suppressed. They're being treated for leukemia, or they've had liver transplants or whatever. Beyond that, I think there's a strong case for wider, and the UK is widening its booster campaign. I think to me, there was never any doubt about the need to vaccinate people over 80 and people with other conditions, including, I would add, people with severe obesity, who it's been shown don't respond as well to vaccines generally, and COVID vaccine in particular. The UK has decided to go along with boosting people over 50, which includes me. And although I probably, if I'd been responsible for the decision, I probably at this stage wouldn't have required people like me to be vaccinated. If I'm offered it, I will. When I'm offered it now, actually, because I will definitely still take it up. There is some interesting data out of Israel in the last few days that I've seen to suggest that a third booster, or sorry, it'd be a second booster, the third dose, somewhat later, may well reduce the risk of hospitalization even more than just the first two. So I think that is going to be the way forward. And I just hope we've got enough vaccine in the world to continue to provide vaccines to countries that don't have enough at the moment to enable us to do that in the West.
Well, that's the next, and I'm sorry, I know there are so many other questions here, all of them good, but I'm going to have to cut it off here. So, hang on, Andrew, no, this one. So, Rodwell asked, do we vaccinate our neighbours like Indonesia before our children? So, Rod, let me just let you know, because Australia got into this massive vaccine snobbery, we actually have had an oversupply of AstraZeneca to the tune of millions, and we have given, as in for free, about 4 million doses of vaccine to the South Pacific, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. But Professor Hunter, it's a good question. By leaving so much of the world unvaccinated, are we creating that sort of petri dish for new variants, for this to maybe get out of control again?
Yeah, absolutely. It is going to be ultimately in our interests for everybody to be vaccinated. And then we can go back to living our lives as though COVID doesn't matter. And yeah, I mean, I must confess, I was very much on the fence over vaccinating teenagers. Along with, it must be said, our vaccine advisory committee, which couldn't decide, that decided against vaccinating teenagers, and I think it'll be slightly different in the Southern Hemisphere, because in our part of the world, more of our children have already had the infection and recovered than I think in your part of the world. So there is probably more value of vaccinating teenagers in Australia than there is in the UK. But I think the value of using those vaccines to benefit other areas where we're not even aren't able to vaccinate even their most vulnerable, I think is a better use of the vaccines than vaccinating teenagers at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, in that last answer, you actually answered about 6 questions in the list. So thank you for that. And I think you also suggested, because there were some questions here about treating it with, I can never pronounce this properly, but ivermectin.
Ivermectin, yes.
Yeah, and I think your view is that as time goes on, our ability to treat COVID is also improving as well.
It is, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there is belief or otherwise in ivermectin seems to be more politically driven than scientifically driven at the moment, as I can understand it. And I would certainly go along with the majority scientific opinion that ivermectin isn't an appropriate treatment for COVID at the moment. But as we say, there are treatments being developed. I suspect, most of us won't need to be treated. Ultimately, most of us won't need to be treated or given treatment for COVID if we've had the vaccine, and particularly if we've had the vaccine and once we've recovered from our first natural infection after that. And but going back to the question earlier on about people who are particularly vulnerable and who aren't able to be vaccinated, or indeed have had the vaccine and are still vulnerable because they've not responded as well to the vaccine as we would have liked. And I think that is going to be the area where we need to be putting a lot of effort into trying to work out how we can treat those people early enough to prevent them going on to develop severe illness, detecting infection in those people, and then coming up with effective early treatments. And but as I said, this is not that's not a specific area that I have been keeping up to date with, because there's only so many hours in the day, and there's a heck of a lot of research going on in COVID at the moment.
I know the feeling. Professor Hunter, can I thank you so much? Well, can I also say that a lot of us over here are watching, or down here maybe, from your perspective. Yes. So a lot of us down here are watching with great interest what happens in the United Kingdom as we hit our Freedom Day. And so look, best of luck. We hope you don't have to go into lockdown again as we hit our summer. And yeah, look, let us know if there's anything we can do.
That's it. Yeah, and I'm actually pretty optimistic that we won't need to go into lockdown again. I can't be certain. I think the one thing that worries me in the UK is whether we get a bad flu year this winter, because that could make things very difficult. But if we don't get a bad flu year, I think we are definitely past the worst of COVID, and I'm pretty optimistic about the future. But not everybody is.
Well, I think your second last set of words, which is you're pretty optimistic, is a good way to leave it. So thank you so much, and I'm so glad the time's worked out. And if you're ever down here, please look us up.
I will indeed. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.